Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ASEAN-EU Dialogue webinar series for the first one today, hosted by the Asia-Europe Institute and part of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. I would like to request that non-speakers and non-participants, if you could, to mute your microphones as well as to turn off your video link in order to help make the connection better. And it will also help with the speakers in order to make sure that we are clear in terms of the presentation of the speaking. We have currently 3 of our speakers, and I believe we are perhaps having some technical difficulties with one of our speakers, and hopefully he will join us as we continue, but we will start anyway. So at the moment right now, we have about 80 participants as well as others in the lobby, which we'll admit as they come in. So this webinar is part of the activities hosted by the Asia-Europe Institute in its role as the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. And the AEI envisions to enhance the field of EU and comparative regional ASEAN and EU comparative regionalism studies in Malaysia. And as part of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, we are hosting the project, a 3-year-long project called ASEAN-EU in dialogue, learning from one another. And for the past 3 years, this institute have been working together with various other partners, not only in producing research and publications, but to also successfully host various workshops and public lectures that we base on our yearly theme. The first year being on economic cooperation, second year on political security, and this year we are focusing on social culture synergy. And originally, we had the ASEAN-EU Dialogue as an annual conference, which has been the highlight event for the Jean Monnet activities, bringing together academicians, policymakers, and thought leaders around Asia and Europe to share and discuss their views on various issues. So therefore, this ASEAN-EU Dialogue webinar series is to embrace the same spirit as we bring together experts to discuss pertinent issues that our community faces. And we are honored to have with us today such esteemed speakers for the first session of the ASEAN-EU Dialogue, which is inherently fitting that we talk about the fundamental adjustments that we are going through economically and politically, and thus therefore this topic of this week's webinar is on the new perspectives on the COVID-19 and the new normal. Before I begin to introduce our speakers, I would like to invite our Deputy Executive Director, Professor Sarina, to say a few words. Professor Sarina, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Noliana. Greetings to all. We are connecting to all of you from the Asia-Europe Institute, University of Malaya. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you all are from the world. And I think it's a great pleasure in welcoming you all to the ASEAN-EU Dialogue webinar on COVID, that is the new normal. Now, there are many countries right now that are easing their economic and social restrictions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there has been a lot of talk as to what this new normal is. Now, as countries around the world is trying to find a cure or a vaccine for COVID-19, we all now need to adjust to this new normal. Society today will see fundamental adjustment in various aspects as we deal with this new normal. So therefore, this webinar aims to contribute to efforts in broadening our understanding of what this entails, particularly from perspective of ASEAN and EU. Our invited speakers from overseas, as well as our very own local experts, will cover issues of the new economic reality, as well as the impact of pandemic on governance and the world order. The discussion of this webinar will undoubtedly contribute towards a better understanding of what this new normal is. And I hope that you will use this webinar as a platform to network while reflecting on the adjustment that we all need to deal with. Let us pray that this webinar will be a great success, and I wish you all an enjoyable and a productive discussion. Thank you all. Over to you, Dr. Noliana.
All right. Just before we begin, I would like to check. I think one of our speakers, Professor Anis, are you here with us yet? All right. Thank you very much, Prof. Sarina. I think we'll proceed. Professor Anis Barak is already here with us. He has sent me an email, but I think perhaps the connection is still having an issue. But we will proceed, I think, then with our speakers, since the rest of our speakers are already here. So let me begin by introducing our first speaker, someone very familiar, particularly to us here in Malaysia, but also globally, our distinguished Professor Dato Dr. Raja Rasia. So Dr. Raja Rasia is a distinguished professor of economics here at the Asia-Europe Institute, University of Malaya. And Professor Dr. Raja is a globally renowned economist, academician, researcher, author, consultant, advisor, just to name a few of the caps that he has worn. With the doctorates in economics from Cambridge University, Professor Raja has previously been appointed as the Rajawali Fellow at Harvard University in 2014, and he has also served in various advisory, professional, and research positions in many prominent universities around the world, as well as authored and contributed to policy papers for international organizations such as the World Bank, UNESCO, the UNDP, as well as the ASEAN Development Bank, just to name a few. So Prof. Raja, please go ahead. But before we begin that, I'd like to request the other participants if you could switch off your video link in order to help stabilize the line if you are not one of the speakers. Thank you very much. Prof. Raja, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Norliana, for the glowing and generous account about myself. It's nice to get back to my colleagues. Seem to be missing them. Nice to see you all again. And a distinguished guest, I believe there are many others who will probably articulate bringing us the picture on COVID-19. I wanted to address three things in the first round given to us. The first, it's important to have some sort of grasp about COVID-19, coronavirus pandemic that we're facing. Unlike an epidemic, that the borders are not open in this case, and it's just like the Spanish flu of 1918. It spread, requires social distancing. It's an infectious disease that spreads through contact. Now, taking that into account, it's not very simple. It's not something where you can clearly say that if a country is a lot more developed, then it's likely that that country would be having much more serious problems with regards to this pandemic. As you all know by now, initially we had the problem unraveling in China, and then subsequently spreading through, but today China is not the most affected country. If you look at the statistics, the US contributes something like 4.3% of the world's population, 7.8 billion people. The US population is more than 330 million. Yet the US accounts for something like 27% of infections that have been reported. And not only that, it's slightly more than 25% of deaths. That's incredible for a developed country with a per capita income in 2010 prior to this coming to something like 56,000 US. The Koreans have something like 28,000, but the incidents that they have for every 1 million persons, there are only about 4 of them that have died, unlike the US 339. And in the case of China, it's 3. Malaysia is again 3. We have an incredibly successful record, courtesy to our head of the medical protocol, Dr. Nur Hisham. Some countries are now suddenly facing a serious surge in infections, and that's at the same time. People don't seem to learn from the experience of Italy, Spain, the UK, in particular in Europe, that suddenly saw a huge rise, a surge in both infections and deaths. And now you see Brazil and India going the same route, and they probably will fall even further. And I think these facts are important, even though however much we know about the disease, we are still conjecturing in the sense that you will find equal numbers of papers that are telling us that this is a disease that's been born from the lab, and then equally the same number of papers that will tell us that no, it's from reality, from how it jumps from either pangolins or bats to humans. Now, that sort of conjecturing, I think, will go on for some time, and me as an economist would not like to get involved in this, except to discuss the second important point. Mainstream economists tend to look at the pandemic that we have as an axis of one, what we do with health, and the second, what we do with the economy. Now, the first one, of course, is important, critically important, because we are talking about life and death. And it's important to note that unlike President Donald Trump, who seems to be giving less importance to if the people die, very much like what Charles Darwin would articulate, that the best would survive. And now, I think the world, fortunately, is not really taking that line, except for some like President Bolsonaro from Brazil. Now, in that sort of context, I'd like to mention that while we can have two axes, on the y-axis you can have proxies of economics, like unemployment rate soaring, like GDP in recession, meaning that their negative growth rates is contracting, exports are falling, supply chains are getting disrupted. You can put all that as proxies. You can normalize and have one index if you want, and on the x-axis you will have to have health indicators, infections, deaths, and the potential, the spillover that it's giving out in terms of how it spreads. Now, I think what is missing, I see from most mainstream works, is the fact that they don't seem to give life to it. I think this is a problem that requires interdisciplinary lenses to understand, to comprehend. That would mean that we can't have this linear, including non-linear models that simply simplify and reduce them to those kinds of proxies, and then we end up saying that this is the solution that we must have. I think if you have countries that have taken care of the lockdown very well, and it would include my own country, Malaysia, which had the highest record initially when the pandemic exploded, but now it's no longer the worst. But we should also look at examples like Vietnam. Vietnam has got a population of 97 million. It's got a per capita income of about 2,000 US 2010 prices. Malaysia is about 12,000. China is about 8,000. Much less than Korea, but yet they are taking care of these things much better simply because they've been much more careful. They've been doing their tracking much better, even though Vietnam's healthcare services arguably is far inferior to Malaysia's. We use all the indicators that we have, whether we're dealing with malnutrition or by the age of 5, mortality, all sorts of indicators would still put Malaysia that much higher. So what I'm saying here is, it is important that an attempt to understand this requires that we look at 4 critical variables. The UN uses 17 proxies, the Sustainable Development Goals. I can just put them all into 4. The first is, you cannot probably disregard material growth, even though the countries that are developed very much are not focusing so much on that, like Singapore. Now, that need to connect with the environment. And by that, I'm not just talking about the environment having to be decarbonized, bringing carbon dioxide levels down, or GHG emissions down, but we're talking about whether we are deforesting too much, or whether we are harming the balance we have with fauna and flora, whether we're dealing with animals, for example, wild animals. How are we in relation to harmonizing ourselves from them? We're also dealing with those kinds of issues. Then the next one is health. Interestingly, I found in my own recent paper that I've been working on to give a public lecture, I found that countries that are socioeconomically very unequal, even though they may have high per capita incomes like the US. The US has shown continuous rise in material standards of living, but it has shown a worsening of health indicators like the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people. It has systematically fallen over the last 50 years. The US also shows a worsening of the Gini coefficient. Inequality obviously is going up. And at the same time, you can see that the US is not performing well on this. It's not just leadership that we see is a problem now with regards to how President Donald Trump is handling this, but also the fact that the structures are unequal. Same with India. India has got the same sorts of problem because they have huge numbers of poor. 70% of them arguably can be considered as poor. At the same time, we also have problems of migrants. And this migrant issue is something, even in countries that have much higher incomes, not so much captured in how inequality is measured. That includes Malaysia and Singapore. Now we see the problem with them. Most of the infections now are coming from foreign workers simply because they are not taken care of. They are not in the normal economy where they have the kind of living that the others are sharing from the material statistics that you find. So what I'm saying here, there must be a balance between these four critical variables. And this is something the new normal must take into account, and not just the fact that we have technologies evolving. Industry 4.0 has allowed us to do teleworking, telebanking, telebusiness, whole range of activities that we can do with social distancing. In that sense, we may have to embrace these things a lot more, but you need to also empower the people. You need to also ensure that people are participants in this entire process. Now, I think in I shall not take that much more time, apart from mentioning that this pandemic should be seen as a problem that should bring humanity together, so we cooperate, we collaborate to see best practices are handled and appropriated well. Not so much finger pointing that the WHO failed to tell us quick enough. China bailed out a WHO when this problem was that much present much earlier. All sorts of, it doesn't really help at this moment. I think if we can work together as one entity, knowing that we need to save ourselves from that common enemy, I think we'll be going in the right direction. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Raja. For sharing your views currently on how things are both on the issue of health and economy. I'd like to request again that everyone to mute their mic because we would have an echo instead. Moving along, we have our second speaker with us, Professor Leif Dirks from Germany. Professor Dirks was appointed Professor of Finance, International Capital Market at Lübeck University of Applied Sciences in the winter of 2013. He's held guest professorships in universities around the world in Kazakhstan, Jordan, Thailand, and China, among to name a few. Dr. Dirks has also served previously as the global head of covered bond strategy at the US Investment Bank of Morgan Stanley in London, as well as work as the vice president in analyzing European fixed income market at the Barclays Capital in Frankfurt. I believe Dr. Dirks have slides to share with us. I would invite you to go ahead and share your screen, sir, if you would like to start.
Well, thank you very much, dear Dr. Noliana. First of all, I would like to seize the opportunity to thank you for this very kind invitation. And I can only comment on what my predecessor has said. I believe we all are in this together, so it doesn't make any sense to engage in a policy of finger pointing, trying to play the blame game, but instead it serves us well to look forward. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you have heard, I'm clearly not a medical expert after all. I am rather an economist. And what is more, my focus lies on the euro area. It lies perhaps even on Germany. So the next couple of moments will mostly focus on how we perceive the situation to be in the euro area. And to give you a head start, I am badly torn between fundamental data on the one hand side, which I believe points towards a further deterioration of the situation before things can improve, and on the other hand side, what capital markets make out of this. But let me briefly start, and I think we all are aware. This is the most recent news on behalf of the International Monetary Fund, that we will face the worst recession since the end of the Second World War in 2020. And the numbers I have collected indicate a decline of roughly 8% this year in Germany, 11% for France. Well, and if that were not enough, one of the currently weaker members of the currency union, Italy, is expected to see a drop of up to 15% in its GDP. Now, let these numbers work on you. What we observe here is a considerably stronger collapse, to call the kid by its name, than after Lehman Brothers went bust. What we have seen in 2008 and 2009 was bad, no doubt, but it was nothing compared to what we are going to witness nowadays. Needless to say, the question which arises now is, what shall we do? What can we do? And as an economist, your top picks would always be either money, that is monetary policy, or alternatively fiscal policy. And in an ideal world, I would say, well, why not combine these two? But let's have a look at what we have so far. Since 2012, since the sovereign debt crisis, we have seen that the European Central Bank engaged in a monetary policy of quantitative easing, which, while we speak, amounts to as much as 2,600 billion euros. That is the so-called asset purchase program, allowing the ECB to buy fixed income securities off the secondary market. Well, technically speaking, you ruin the market because they collect whatever clip is available, driving up prices and driving down yields. And now, ladies and gentlemen, just to put this into perspective, if I have got an economic environment in which people engage in a flight to quality, in which they want to buy safe haven assets, like, for example, German government bonds, and at the same time I have to compete against the central bank, which by definition has way deeper pockets than I have, well, this must not end well, because at the end of the day, me being a portfolio manager, I am kind of forced into riskier asset classes, eventually into asset classes which I don't have a very sound and a very thorough understanding of. Well, and if this is not enough, the ECB has, in light of COVID-19, introduced another 1.35 trillion, that is 1,350 billion pandemic emergency purchase program. So at the end of the day, we are speaking about a volume of roughly 4 trillion euros, which has been put to work in an attempt to moderate the fallout from the diverse crises we have. And what is more, the interest rate has been cut down to 0%. It is anchored at its zero lower bound ever since 2017, which means for quite a while we already have an extremely accommodative monetary policy. And those of you who have just heard mainstream economics, those of you who pursue a more monetarist view, you would say, well, this must trigger inflation. It is just a matter of time before inflation in the euro area will get out of control. But look at the numbers. The most recent ones we have for May 2020 indicate an inflation of the harmonized index of consumer prices of merely 0.1%. So, to put things together here, on the one hand side, we see that markets are flooded with cash. But apparently, this does not leave its mark on the inflation rate. And therefore, the question we need to raise and answer is, where does all this money go? What is happening here? Have a look at this almost exponential growth post-2015. This is the total assets I have collected here for you. And you can see the sharp increase post-Greece insolvency in 2012, 2013. And as far as I'm concerned, there is no reason to believe that this number will go down anytime soon. So where does all this cash go? Where does the cash we have used to fight COVID-19 go? And now look here. Most recent data which point to the Euro Stoxx 50, which is the index summarizing the 50 biggest by market capitalization European, that is Euro area blue chips. And even though we have not returned to pre-crisis levels, I believe the trend is intact, and you can see that, again, we are approaching pre-crisis levels at a great pace. And if you had a look at the newspapers earlier this morning, you will have seen that US stocks have wiped out all losses which they had collected year to date last night. So again, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I'll repeat myself here, but isn't this a paradox? On the one hand side, we've got a global pandemic affecting hundreds of thousands of people. But from an economic perspective, we all are aware that there will be a bad recession ahead of us. Only capital markets don't seem to care. In Germany, we are back on track when it comes to reaching the record high. Today we stand at 12,900 points, and we just need another 700 points to wipe out all losses we have had. Notwithstanding that companies go bust, notwithstanding that we have a massive increase in unemployment data, etc. So my question is, isn't this irrational? You will recall that this is not my term. This is a notion. This is a word originally coined by Alan Greenspan, who said that eventually markets have decoupled themselves from reality. And I would like to share this view with you because I am not concerned whether or not we have seen a decoupling of market expectations from fundamental values. The central bank's cash has gone into the equity markets. It has gone into real estate markets, and needless to say, it has gone into the fixed income markets. But to a certain extent, this has happened because there are no decent alternatives. And I am slightly concerned that we might see the creation of yet another speculative bubble, or to put it in other words, perhaps a crisis in economic terms, which has originally been created by an abundance of cash, is now even made worse by more and cheaper cash. German exports are down 30% on the year. That is a disaster for an economy which is so badly focusing on exports. The increase in unemployment numbers is not reflected here. We have got supply chains which are completely distorted. We are just to open the air freight market again. Basically, tourism and travel has ground to a halt, and so has logistics, so have shipments. So how can it be that equity indices across the euro area point towards new records? We do have some fiscal policy measures. Germany alone wants to spend 130 billion on the German economy. We'll see a temporary VAT reduction to 16 from 19%. And if you have a kid, you will get a lump sum payment of 300 euros. But in the bigger context, the idea which Germany and France came up with together, namely to provide a 500 billion recovery fund servicing countries which have been baddest or have been worst hit, this has already come under scrutiny by the Frugal Four. So you have Sweden, Denmark, you have Austria, and you have the Netherlands here, questioning whether this should really be a payment, a transfer, or whether perhaps this should better be a loan and nothing else. Which means even in times of a crisis as bad as we witness nowadays, this currency union, the euro area, does not manage to pull itself together and to speak with one voice. Ladies and gentlemen, to wrap up here, I am afraid that before the pandemic hit, we had seen some kind of omni-bubble creating here. Virtually all asset classes were affected, and the price development had decoupled itself from the underlying fundamentals. As a result of the pandemic, we have seen a correction, yes, but on the basis of the charts which I have just shared with you, you have seen that this correction was at best temporary. And the current recovery rally we have might, in my view, be somewhat overdone because it does not reflect the market reality. It does not reflect the fundamental situation, which I believe is way worse than numbers make us believe. Ladies and gentlemen, again, let me seize the opportunity to thank you for the very kind invitation. Let me seize the opportunity to thank Dr. Noriana for the wonderful presentation. And that said, I'd like to give the mic back to you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Dirks, for the wonderful presentation. So we've heard already.
I've lost you, even though we are just a few rooms away.
My apologies. A technical glitch, it would seem. So, as I was saying, we saw how the socioeconomic distribution has not reflected immediate results on how countries deal with the pandemic. And also, as Professor Dirks has shared with us as well, the fact that there has been an uncoupling in the reality between the market versus the financial capital market. So moving along, we will now look into political security perspective, and I would like to introduce. We have who is chairperson and professor in international law and global political studies, as well as head of department for strategic studies on Asia at the International Institute for Middle East and Balkan Studies at Ljubljana, Slovenia. He has authored 7 books from various American and European publishers, as well as numerous articles on geopolitical energy and technology. Professor is also the editor of the New York-based Geopolitics, History and International Relations Journal of the Addington Academic Publisher, as well as the editorial board members of several similar specialized magazines spanning over 3 continents. We're very happy to have you here with us, Professor. Professor Barry Tarvik, you are most welcome to start your presentation. Professor, you are muted, sir. You need to unmute your mic.
Here.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon in KL and good morning in Europe. We have a slow morning here in Vienna. It's very rainy and it's cold, exceptionally cold for this part of the year. But when the lockdown was here, be sure, it was a beautiful weather. Now when it's relaxed, so now the rain comes back. I'm happy to be there with you. It was a great show, so you are moderating very well, all of us. And I've heard the speakers before, so it was really very exciting and to listen. And also there is always something to learn, so I'm always eager to learn things. Coming back to what you suggested, what you have made an introduction, so giving me a frame of talk. I think that on your side there were two articles, 2 parts of the same story, same article published already. So I think the readers, because I have nothing structured for this morning, but readers can find actually we really opinionate on the issues. So I invite everyone to visit those texts, which are very, very clearly pointing things. One of the major problems of the world, which was, just Corona, so-called Corona event, because most probably we have had asymmetric responses, disproportionate responses to it. So it's better to call it not pandemic, but to call it, let's say, event, C-19 event, Corona event. And I'm sure that history will revert in that way to it. So, as any other crisis before, first and most of all, or last of all, this is a crisis of cognitive mind. Because if it is illness, it has been produced by something, and most probably by imbalances. Okay, so it's an esoteric philosophical explanation of it, but also a very practical one. So if you want to find any sort of, let's say, responses to it, we have also to return to a cognitive mind. I mean, my colleague from Germany was just mentioning it. So most of it would come with simply with a clear reasoning, which is not always in the box, but a little bit, in a way, out of box. So, meaning that actually C-19 was just accelerating things which were already present in the world. So from, let's say, my point of view, this was primarily the lack of the cooperation in intergovernmental level. What does it mean? So that practically means that the world was reducing actually way how it has been conducting major affairs to a fewer and fewer players. So now is the moment to return to multilateralism. And in the article that I mentioned before, was clearly stated and was published widely around that basically we have to return things to United Nations, which is, though imperfect, the only existing really planetary, universal or global body that we have. And this should be done through the intergovernmental mechanism. This is one of the first and most important things which invites energetically all countries to cooperate. So Malaysia has a perfect position, the physical position, but also, let's say, its own cultural position to be one of those, because Asian theater is one of the most fascinating, most vibrant, and most dynamic region, which needs also to articulate symmetrically to its position, its own say, the gravity in intergovernmental decision making. And that means through ASEAN, through non-aligned movement, through United Nations, and all other forums, Islamic Conference, and all other forums that Malaysia participates. As it is also multiracial, multinational, and let's say, ethnic society, so that practically feels the rhythm of Asia. So it's naturally positioned, and it's traditionally or historically it's a seafaring nation, it's a trading nation. So practically the multilateralism is already in a cultural beat, is already present and it's there. So this is something that practically each and every country. So it's not time to sit and wait for someone else to solve the problem, but basically for the energetic participation of each and every, let's say, nation of the world. This is the most important. We need stakeholders within the societies, but this is not to be discussed by private businesses. We don't need philanthropists who would actually conduct the things. If we have very rich individuals or entities, they should pay equal share of their taxes. And then through the other stakeholders in society, we should be running things through the intergovernmental way. And there are also a couple of other segments, which is actually that we have to revisit, so-called PPPs, the private-public partnerships within the international organizations. I think that already through this crisis, but before, it was also striking that practically there is no possibility that the private sector pays the international organizations more than 5%. It is unthinkable, and it is simply unacceptable that we have private entities who are paying actually more. So what is happening now? United States is withdrawing from the universal organizations, the specialized agencies of the UN system, which is related to health issues. So United States is moving, and we have the private entity who is the solo biggest donor, which means that the trust to this global body that have to coordinate and articulate entire activities of the planet we are losing actually a faith and the trust in such an institution. And we don't have a replication of it. We need to coordinate so many activities. And this is absolutely tricky position in which we are right now. So that energetically invites each and every nation to actively involve, and also through the Security Council. Security Council has a special, let's say, setup in a way, because out of the 15 members, 5 are a little bit more equal than the others, because they are so-called P5s, the permanent 5 members who are having a veto power and so on and so forth. But also, that doesn't excuse the other 10 non-permanent members to not to be active and not to be pushing. And I mean, roughly there are 3,000 resolutions altogether that have been brokered since 1945 up to practically April of this year, and out of which the veto has been triggered some roughly 260 times. So that is the ratio 10-1 of the attempted resolutions, which are actually let's say the legal documents of the biggest mandate or authority on the global scale. So that means that basically the ratio was 10-1. So apparently that the other countries which are not P5 were the drivers within the Security Council, and this is actually the rest, not the big ones, but the rest. And one of the problems of the big powers is that the big powers are always thinking big, and when you are thinking big, one of the main prerequisites is actually to deter and to contain or to slow down your rivals, your real rivals or your imaginary rivals. This is the logics of the big powers. So the big powers are always chasing big games, and they are very often missing actually to follow what are the planetary needs. And then you practically come, or that opens the way for the real stewardship of the smaller entities or smaller countries or smaller groupings who are really carrying the issues of the planet. And this is how we come actually to others, especially in the Security Council, but also in General Assembly, in specialized agencies. And right now, with this crisis, actually, with the in so-called financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we've been turning to Bretton Woods institutions of World Bank, of International Monetary Fund, and so on and so forth, or WTO. So practically, in whatever crisis might come, the next crisis might be a crisis of aviation. We will turn to International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal, or it could be a tourism. So we will turn to one organization, or food, which is then the issue of FAO. So in whatever direction we move with so-called crisis or the problem to solve, or to forum simply to sit and meet and discuss and to bring some international instruments, we need international forums in which practically we need an active participation of each and every segment. So that includes, of course, Malaysia, as I said, through the position. ASEAN is one of the most vibrant, actually, organizations that exists, and I mean, novelties for the speaker, for our spectators from other places. But you in ASEAN, you well know, if ASEAN economies are combined, they would be larger than the economy of India. So they would be right after Japan, China, and United States. So it would be a 4th largest economy. It's also a huge demography. Over 500 million people. So practically also this should be transposed, articulated also in the political say in the institutions. Because whatever we decide, of course, there are substantive issues to be discussed, but first and most of all, we need to take a political stance and to have political decisions. And they are practically deteriorating right now. So it was a long waiting period in which actually everybody was looking around who would take a lead, who would start. And therefore we had the world practically on autopilot. So practically people in a cabin were relaxed and leaning back in their seats, and practically the plane was flown by autopilot, not by the real pilots. And for a couple of months actually we had the force of habit. So simply everything in the world was moving in that direction. We also have to, so what is very important, the exit of so-called C-19 event should not be on expenses of human rights and should be not on expenses of labor. We've been, and I think the colleague from Germany also mentioned this, so we've been overestimating the financial capitals and the financial markets and this and that. Look at it now. You know, financial market has been intact, but the whole planet have stopped. Why planet have stopped? Because practically people were forced to stay at home and to practice social distancing. So that means that when we stop labor, everything stops. So in the critical conjunctures, actually in the last 50 years, whenever crisis was coming, you know, and when we as a critical decision makers were deciding between the capital and the labor was sacrificed. Labor paid the price, not the financial markets, not the capital. And I think that now is time actually for the share burden of everyone. So this exit should not be on expenses of human rights, essential human rights, and also on expenses of labor. This is very important. And also we have to put into scrutiny all implications of artificial intelligence, including 5G, and also with the health. One of the segments, very important segments of human rights is also a right to health. And right to health includes actually not manufactured consent, but informed consent. When you go to your medical doctor and or hospital, for that matter, so you need informed consent, because of course you don't understand, you know, you go to pneumologist or you go to physiologist, so they have to explain you the treatment because you don't understand if you are not medical doctor. So that means not manufactured consent over medication, but informed consent. And it should not be prescribed from one place and one for everyone. This is that practically comes to human rights. This is an important thing. So we are talking, and also the binary categorization. We are for vaccine or against vaccine. This is a reductionism which is very dangerous. It exhausts us so much that we are actually reducing the entire health problem on manufacturing this or that. There is no silver bullet. We have to put it holistically. And it starts and ends in human rights, because right to health is essential part of human rights. Right to dignity, to have, let's say, right for self-determination is also coupled with the right, with the decent labor. Because if you are unable to be a part of a labor, you have no decent life. Without decent life, you have no right to actually, for self-determination, to live as you want to live, because you need means for that, and you need to be socialized. If you are out of the labor market, you are not socialized. So those are elementary. So to sum up, practically, we need to restore the trust into global institutions. We have to revisit those so-called PPPs. PPPs in certain segments within the nation or in the subnational level are excellent news, but not in intergovernmental organizations that are discussing very, very important issues like food, like health, like aviation, like Atomic Energy Agency, biological weapon, and so on and so forth. So in those things we have to revisit, and we have to scale the level to which private sector will participate. We don't need philanthropists, we need people who diligently pay taxes, because many of the big corporations are actually parking their monies outside of in so-called safe haven, in zones. And also we have to revisit the idea of the Tobin tax initiative. There is the money on this planet, but we have to really, we have to decide what kind of planet we want and which kind of redistribution, because every crisis brings a new redistribution. So we have carefully to watch out on this. And again, to put our questions, whether this crisis will be again paid by labor, not by capital. I think it's time to make a fair share on both. And elementary human rights, because we need a fully fledged restoration of human rights as it was before the crisis, or even a higher standard which follows, of course, the so-called Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So I think at this point I would stop. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Anis. That does tie back in with what Professor Dirks has been talking about, and the decoupling between the capital and the labor market and those differences, particularly in what governments need to do. So last and not least, we will move on to our final speaker before we have our Q&A session. Just to tell all our esteemed speakers, we have about 120 participants and we have questions coming in. I will not be able perhaps to go over all the questions due to time constraint, but we will select and share questions to all our speakers. Now, finally, we have Dr. Rahul Mishra, who is a senior lecturer here with us at the Asia-Europe Institute. Dr. Mishra specializes on political security affairs of the Asia-Pacific region, and he has had more than 150 national and international publications to his credit, with focusing on Asia-Pacific affairs. Some of the books that he has edited include the BCIM Economic Corridor, The Road Ahead with the Pentagon Press, The Peacock and the Garuda, an overview of the India-Indonesia relations, as well as integrating Northeast Asia in India's Act East policy. So, Dr. Rahul, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Lin, for that kind introduction. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think much ground has already been covered, especially with regard to the economic dimensions and emerging and critical technologies. Also, listening to the three professors, all of them are senior to me, I felt that I am going to be the bad man, not talking about what ought to be done, but instead I'm going to talk about what is actually happening on the ground in the mean business of international politics and international relations. So pardon me if I offend any of your feelings, but the world actually is what Donald Trump and Xi Jinping and leaders across the world, the way they have been running, the rise of populist movements, anti-globalization, not really a de-globalization movement, but certainly an emerging trend on controlling the movement of people, and also shutting your borders, national boundaries becoming more important, and most of all, theoretically speaking, I think the bouncing back of nation states is something that I see as a scholar of international relations. So I think in strategic terms, there are four emerging trends, four prominent trends that are emerging for the post-COVID world order. These trends were already there. What COVID has done is it has fastened the pace of this transition. Most of these changes were happening for quite some time. The first is, of course, a massive loss of American predominance, both in terms of material capabilities and soft power. Post-COVID America is no longer going to be what it was before, and we are already witnessing several prominent trends there, not just in terms of the flaws that are there in their public healthcare system or several other issues, the economy crumbling, people getting restless, also the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement that has also exposed the internal rifts that are there within America, and one hopes that Donald Trump would deal with these issues sensibly. I think at the same time, China, which has aspired to become a global power, a global hegemon, it has tried to do that for past couple of decades. It has also suffered a heavy loss of credibility. The way China handled the COVID outbreak, and also its idea of making territorial advances, some of them are going on at this moment in Asia, are certainly backfiring. My third point is about eroding credibility of multilateral institutions and challenges that are thrown to the idea of globalization, particularly by the populist, mercantilist governments across the world. And I think there, the point to be noticed is the way European Union has not lived up to the expectations of countries such as Italy and Spain. Former Prime Minister of Italy, Enrico Letta, in an interview with The Guardian, had said that even in Europe, we are going to see the Italian way of looking at things, the Italian way of world order, the Belgian way of world order, the German way of world order. So there are divergent opinions within the European Union as well. My fourth and final point is about the middle and emerging powers. Which side are they going to go with? Which of these two major powers they are going to go with? Are they going to support multilateral organizations and globalization? Are they going to re-strengthen the United Nations, as Professor Ane said, or they are going to strengthen the WHO following what has happened recently, or rather defying the American position on WHO? Are the questions, are the issues that are going to shape the post-COVID world order. If I'm allowed to elaborate, I'll first go to the first point, which is the international system. I think the international liberal order, as we understand it, has been going massive transformations. The defining features of international liberal order, the US as the predominant power, free and open trade, globalization, international organizations, multilateral institutions, all these foundational pillars of the system, all of them are facing a lot of tensions at this moment. And unfortunately, we are not seeing light at the end of the tunnel. So I don't know how things would shape up, but certainly at this moment, it is quite a tense situation. COVID-19 has shown that US is no longer the hegemon that has control over resources or institutions. It has also sort of exposed America's inability to control multilateral institutions, also countries such as China. So it has not shaped their behavior. Power is actually defined as your ability to shape behavior of other countries or other individuals. And that is not happening at this moment. Internally, we know that America has lost more than 60,000 lives. If you compare this with 9/11 situation, the statements back then that were given by George W. Bush, we didn't say any of that. America at no point in this crisis came up and said that, look, we are in a position to take this challenge head on and we are going to lead the world the way it had happened after 9/11. What we are seeing is Donald Trump accusing over and again just the other country. He has been accusing China for all the problems that have surfaced, which is not right. I mean, it is as the president of the United States and also as leader of the so-called most important, most powerful country. So I think COVID has busted the myth, thanks also to Hollywood, the myth that was there, that US is the mightiest of all hegemon that we've never had in history. So that myth is going to get busted. The American helplessness in tracing, preempting, and combating this non-traditional security threat has baffled international community. Particularly if we compare the responses with Singaporean, Taiwanese, or South Korean responses, how these governments have responded, it becomes clear that the US was certainly not prepared at all for something like this. And this has led to a huge downfall in the image and prestige that America had. And this is going to have huge implications on the international system, something that Henry Kissinger has also alluded to. Now, coming to China, I think China's unprecedented rise has given the impression that as and if the US-led Western international order crumbles, it would lead to China's ascendance. Some scholars have also argued that the downfall of the US is going to lead to the rise of China as the predominant power. Some have actually already declared that COVID-19 has led to the dawn of Asian century, China becoming the leader. I don't quite agree with that point. I think the situation is much more complicated. While the US has its own set of problems, China too has got a lot on its plate. One would have thought that COVID-19 was a good opportunity for China to consolidate its soft power and bring more and more countries on board. That unfortunately has not happened. Look at the ASEAN scenario at this moment and how China, even during the COVID-19 crisis, I'm not talking about how and whether China is responsible for the COVID outbreak or what role it could play in WHO by allowing certain countries or the way it has responded. I'm just talking about China getting more aggressive. Look at the Philippines. Despite its President Duterte's problems with the US, Philippines has stuck with the military pact. Indonesia has refused to have any dialogue with China on the South China Sea. Australia was threatened for economic sanctions because it raised the issue of inquiry, economic independent inquiry at the WHO. UK has been warned on Hong Kong. South Korean, the ambassador, Korean ambassador to the US has said that the time has come when Korea feels that it is in a position to choose between the US and China, and the answer is US. And also with the India, the ongoing border standoff. So all this put together tells us that middle and emerging powers, even though they don't have a choice, are getting compelled to side with the US at this moment, which I think is a bit of a challenge, something that Chinese leadership should understand and take care of. I think in the post-COVID world order, therefore, both the US and China are not in a position to offer something that is that projects them as leaders. What we're going to see is other countries, whether Europe or Asian, they are going to see which one is the lesser evil. And this actually, to my mind, is going to shape the international order to a great extent in times to come. Also, depending on how the US and China trying to get back to the mainstream, as in their leadership role, and also respond to challenges or respond to concerns that have been coming from middle and emerging powers. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Rahul, for your views. So overall today, we've had some very interesting views shared with us by our speakers. The idea, as pointed out by Prof. Raja, socio-economic reality might not necessarily be reflective of how countries have dealt with the pandemic, or the idea that our capital market and our labor market might not necessarily be parallel, moving the same way. So similarly, Prof. Anis has shared his views on why we need to return, or how we need to return to good governance by encouraging more participation in international organizations, and Dr. Rahul's opinion on how things have not really changed in terms of the great power, particularly the problems that are happening with China and the US, as well as the shift in terms of hegemonic powers in the global order. So these are very important things that we consider, considering that much of what we talk about today in terms of the health perspective and the economic perspective really has changed the reality of globally of all countries around the world. So we have quite a few questions that's been coming in, not just on the chat, but also on text message and emails. Let's start with a few questions. We will take about half an hour altogether. We'll try and finish this at 4:30. Perhaps we can start with the first question. I think we can put this question to either Professor Raja or Professor Dierks. From an economist's view, would there be any preliminary data that shows the effectiveness of a lockdown on population? And if there are none, as an economist, do you believe that lockdowns can be carried out without impacting local economies significantly? Perhaps I'd like to invite Professor Raja first.
Let me first put this across, that the lockdown actually calls for closing factories, businesses and so on, apart from some countries holding on to logistics, which deals with transport connections between those people who make purchases, and those people eventually would connect them with factories that produce them. But a whole lot of these things are actually undergoing changes even before the pandemic, For example, the fact that JCPenney was going to close down was already obvious because of the emergence of logistics companies like Lazada, Alibaba, and so on. And the pandemic simply precipitated the collapse of JCPenney. But let me, in the broader question, I'm not sure whether you're implying that, take a leaf out of what Dr. Liav mentioned. Actually, when Alan Greenspan passed the cue to Ben Bernanke, he was the cause of the whole problem, the decoupling of the economy, and not that he saw it coming. He didn't see it coming simply because he made the point, markets are already dominant, markets know what to do. You don't get government officials involved in these matters. And that's exactly what happened there. So you had Fannie Mac and the two companies that were rating, they basically left it to all these stockbrokers to rate organizations on to the point where the bubble was growing. it's just like housing prices rising for 15 years. You can actually look at this work from Stiglitz or even Paul Krugman. In fact, Krugman refers to Alan Greenspan as mud. Now, I was surprised the data that he produced on Europe, because Europe wasn't really following exactly how the US was evolving. Because the US had a situation, not just Bernanke making that point, but also Bob Lucas, leaving things to markets and reducing the role of government. Now, Europe tended, even though they had center-right governments like Merkel's government, what they have now in Britain, not that Tony Blair had anything very different when he was leading the Labour Party there, very much conservative in that sort of sense. But yet, as far as I know, the most extensive work on this begins with Germany, Hilferding's work on what finance capital can actually do. Now, when you have all these huge packages, rescue package, fiscal stimulus targeted to rescue stock markets, this is what you will get. You won't get production going, especially because you've got a pandemic now. Workers cannot be connecting with each other. So the target is not really what one would expect to save lives, to ensure that workers are enjoying wages, although some of them are claiming unemployment benefits, but still, those, especially in the informal sector, are getting nothing. So in relation to that, I would just address this point that these points are key in the reformulation of what sort of economics we want. If we are going to leave this to market forces, if we are going to leave this to what neoliberal economists want, you will get the same sort of order, a decoupling, a separation between labor markets and what financial markets would do. Thank you.
Cool. Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Perhaps Professor Dirks would like to add in on that.
Yes, I will try and be very brief, as we have a lot of questions as I'm concerned here. Now, very clearly, if we force an economy into a lockdown, if we force people to work from home or to not work at all, if we close all universities and schools, it will of course have a devastating direct impact on GDP growth. And secondly, we will have a secondary impact, because if you are afraid of losing your job, you will clearly not consume. And even if the government awards you some lump sum payment, it is not going to work. So in other words, any lockdown, any partial lockdown, or whatever you would like to call it, will have, and now comes the tricky part, a catastrophic impact on the productive part of the industry. It will, at the very same time, however, leave capital markets entirely unaffected, which, unfortunately, brings with it two very brief comments. First, don't underestimate the market power. I keep asking myself whether it is policymakers or markets which effectively are in control and have the power. And I am tempted to say it is the market, most notably the financial market, which brings me to my second point, saying, and that perhaps goes back to what Professor Anis had also mentioned, I wouldn't know of a single example where capital owners at the end of the day had, as you have said, to pay the price, not even during the Great Depression. Capital, as opposed to labor, is highly mobile and always goes to where the yield is highest. If you wanted to introduce a Tobin tax, well, be my guest, but the capital will have moved to any other offshore account no later than tomorrow. So this is only going to work unless you get one global voice. But then just have a look at the euro area. They can't manage to agree on one single compromise. So how would that work on a global scale? And it is not that I don't like the idea. It is just I don't see it coming in the very near future.
Right. That is obviously very interesting in how we are going to then make the change or the improvement between this crack between the labor and the capital market that we have today. So moving along, another question that we have, perhaps I can direct this one to Professor Anis. The question is, dear Professor, some scientists are asserting that the COVID-19 is an aftermath of the exploitation to nature and human being. Do you think that the United Nations' current 17 sustainable goals are sufficient to protect the nature and the world, or do we now need new goals for international organizations in order to prevent future pandemics, such as the COVID-19?
Listen, when you turn to media, you know, when you turn to news, including our Euronews, you know, which in the peak times of C19, we are repeating the word COVID or Corona 7 times in minute. That means less than 10 seconds the word has been repeated. Those are interrogation techniques. This is not information. That has nothing to do anymore with the news. This is really when you are apprehended with the special police, and when you are put under very extensive and very harsh interrogation technique, when the same word has been repeating to you over hours and hours every less than 10 seconds. Okay, so practically when you turn to media, you see talk about illness, and what we have to discuss is the health of the planet, health of individuals. So this is also a strategic choice. And this is, as I said, like every crisis, it's a question of cognitivity. It's a crisis of cognitive mind. But putting back to something, to context, because we talk with a, let's say, Malaysian Kale-based institute. I've been coming repeatedly to Asia for 15 years and talking the same line. And this line has been very simple, and I placed it in a policy paper which has been also published all over, translated in so many languages. There is no Asian century unless you have multi-Asian multilateral setting. Asia is the only continent that has no multilateral setting, and I've been telling and telling for many years, if not decades, the crisis will come and you will have troubles. Europe is simply multilateralized, and this is a story of our success. Whenever you turn the page to Europe, you see Europe is in some sort of crisis, but we are still managing. Where is the triumph out of Asian success story? Even before the COVID, it was impossible to translate this in an overall triumph of Asia. Why? Because you don't have an institution. We in Europe, we are so multilateralized, not because we are smarter, we just walk our history faster than the rest of the planet. And it's not EU, it's Council of Europe, it's OSCE, and then comes the EU, because EU is not Europe. EU covers very important segments of Europe, but also very important segments of Europe are outside. The most successful Muslim state of all time, which is Turkey, Russia, and so on and so forth, Norway, Switzerland, and on. So practically, American continent has Organization of American States. Africa has so-called Organization of African Union, which is of African Unity, which is now even called African Union. And Asia has nothing. Asia has excellent settings, which includes SARCs in the Indian subcontinent, ASEAN, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization on the corner of the western corner is a GCC clubbing, and so on and so forth. But there is no pan-Asian institution. Bottom line, for the countries of ASEAN, including largest demography and largest territorially, largest country of Indonesia, your neighbor, southern neighbor, and very much Malaysia and others, you will. I fear that you come to bitter choices to make exactly the accommodation, as our fellow who was having a flaw the last, actually, that you have the binary categorization. Either you are for America or for China. You should be for Asia. And the best way, not only for the rest of Asia, but especially for China, is the multilateralism.
Right.
Look so what happened. Yeah, look what happened in Europe, was a reunification of Germany. Every time that the center, that the core of Europe was unifying, it triggered a huge war. Mm-hmm. And we had the peaceful unification of Germany. Why? Because there was a trust. How we build the trust? Not through EU, not through Euro, but actually this was the Council of Europe, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and other truly multilateral settings.
Right.
So what is very important for Asia is multilateral setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So in terms of this multilateral setting, you feel that this regional multilateral setting would be more important as opposed to a global international organization, such as the question was asking if we need new development goals that countries will have to shape. So would you think then this is more effectively done at a regional setting?
This is actually the pan-continental setting for Asia is sine qua non. You can't have your century simply because the space, you know, Asia is far larger than Europe, but geopolitical and geoeconomic space is far smaller because there are mega demographies and there are mega economies. When you are projecting yourself economically and demographically, you have grand ideas and you are colliding with the others. Actually, Asia is the only continent on which actually nuclear bomb has been deployed twice. For that matter, it was Japan, but it was still Asia. And it's a home of the junior nuclear powers. Not to go into details, what does it mean actually mutual assurance destruction? So because in the strategy of war, you know, the one that makes a surprise attack has a premium in the war. You know, therefore you go to the hill because from the hill you can attack your enemy. This was a classic way of conducting wars, you know, for centuries. But then so-called mutual assurance destruction has changed when you have capability to absorb the first nuclear shock and to retaliate.
Right. So
in
I
Asia,
guess this changed.
Many junior powers have no that. So they are contemplating actually surprise nuclear attack. They might contemplate this or in the desperate moment. So that means actually the Asia becomes brewing socially, economically, demographically, and also militarily. And so many issues are unsolved. And I would never put things into binary categorization. The fact that China has been overheated is not Asian problem. The main Asian problem is actually the lack of pan-Asian, pan-continental setting. This is the prime concern. The fact that the egotistic interest of the big capital of Europe and United States identify the coastal areas of China as its own industrial suburbia is not your Asian problem, is not the problem of KL. The problem of KL, of Jakarta, of Hanoi, is the problem of the lack of multilateral institution. And I've been repeatedly talking this for nearly 20 years, coming to Asia, taking my time, touring, including your university, million times and talking, IDFR everywhere talking, just same line. And now it comes again to this. Of course, as the previous speakers were telling, China becomes nervous. There is no intellectual appeal offered from the United States and from China. The current leadership of China, there is no intellectual appeal to offer to the world. And we are getting into a vacuum in which actually the most organized or most brutal or the fastest force might try to take an opportunity. So the best tranquilizer, including China, the best long-term situation, I'm telling this also to my Chinese friend, for you, the best is if you have trusted and trustful neighborhood. Germany, and therefore we ended up with a 2 world war because Germany was antagonizing its neighbors. Now it's completely different situation. If China has antagonized neighbors, you know, there is no success. You can't have a success.
I would agree that the things have changed, and definitely with the pandemic, things have been put even into more dire situation for the need for this cooperation and multilateral organization. In saying that, let's turn to
there is nothing new. I mean, we have to, I'm sure that all speakers will agree, you know, there is practically very little new. So we just have amplified problems that were existing earlier.
Correct. So perhaps we can also turn to Dr. Rahul for another question in this idea of amplification of problems. We have a question on how ASEAN is facing these heightened tensions with China. As pointed out by Professor Anis, this is not new, but how do you think ASEAN and EU can work together, particularly in these new and different situations? Dr. Rahul. It seems that we are having technical problems with connecting back with Dr. Rahul. Perhaps we can go back to Professor Raja and Professor Dirks. to ask the next question on the economics, where we've talked about, another question we have is that given the negative interest rate policy shoring in the EU and Japan, would yield a better targeting policy or monetary avenue to artificially suppress borrowing while keeping domestic borrowing well kept through offsetting bond oversupply? Perhaps this one is a question that we should pass to Professor Dirks.
Well, thank you very much. It's, as far as I'm concerned, a very interesting question. Nonetheless, it is very technical too. Apparently, as far as I'm concerned, monetary policy, as we observe in the euro area, has reached its limitations, and even the odd billion added or not will eventually not lead to the desired outcome. I have managed to show you that inflation has no concern as of late. What is more, of course, for governments, it's extremely attractive to borrow at a main refinancing rate of nil. And that said, Germany actually borrows at a negative rate as a result of the ongoing flight to quality. However, if you can borrow at such cheap rates, you will very likely postpone, if not avoid altogether, any structural reforms which are potentially necessary to regain competitiveness. Meaning that the previous homogeneity we have had across the euro area will eventually drift apart. That said, this bond oversupply is something we still wait to materialize. And speaking for the Eurozone, the current discussion is whether or not we shall see so-called Euro bonds coming, or as people like refer to them now, Corona bonds, which will try and share the responsibility for a full and timely payback. Moral hazard, of course, is on the horizon, but your idea to now target the yield curve directly, that is something which has happened. That is nothing else but the so-called Operation Twist, which we have seen both in the United States and in the euro area, with the idea of, at the same time, putting some kind of rate hike in people's horizon, which would bring the short end of the curve up, and at the same time buying bonds which have longer maturities, therefore reducing refinancing costs at the long end. So refinancing costs at the short end go up, and at the long end of the curve go down, in total flattening the curve, thereby getting corporates and banks to refinance themselves for the longer term. So yes, as I've said, good question, technical question, but we do observe a targeting of the yield curve directly by means of the so-called Operation Twist. And back to you, Dr. Lin.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Dirks. I hope that answers the question. Perhaps we can take one more because it is almost 4:30 and we are targeted to finish at 4:30. Professor Raja, one of the questions is, what do you think trade will be like between EU and Asia in the new normal?
Your question properly, can you mention it again?
What do you think trade will be like between EU and Asia in this new normal?
I think, going back to the answers we heard from the preceding speakers, it's important to contrast the 2007-2008 global financial crisis from what we are facing now. Because we didn't have a pandemic. We didn't have a pandemic where the hands of people were tied, factories were closed. And therefore, in the US, for example, apart from the government itself printing money, it had, of course, also had lots of bonds. In addition to the Japanese, the Chinese became a major purchaser of US Treasury bonds. Now, just like Germany, which Dr. Liev mentioned, Japan too faces a situation of having negative real interest rates. When you have a deflationary situation, positive nominal interest adjusted, you're obviously going to get that. So it seems to give this impression that you're going to finance the problem that you're facing now, and with the notion that the negative interest rate would mean servicing it would not be that difficult. Now, this is not the same as those people who believe in fiscal discipline. They somehow don't like debt. This is Kenneth Rogoff or for that matter Reinhardt, they make that sort of point. But what we haven't really seriously known is the health scientists are telling us we're going to have a second wave. Now, how much of money are you going to spend here? It all depends on the kind of projections you make. Now, you want to listen to the scientists or to the economists? That's why I'm somewhat, and the fact that the scientists, including the WHO, are claiming the second one will be a lot worse. I can see the time is running. Pass the cue back to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Raja. I think that overall it has been a very fruitful discussion, and just honestly, the time is not really our friend on this. And we do have quite a few other questions that perhaps in the future I will compile these questions and send them to our speakers individually if you would like to share your opinions on these thoughts. Thank you very much to all our speakers and to all our participants for joining with us today. And we would very much look forward for all of you to join us in the next ASEAN-EU seminar webinar. We have a few more planned in the future. So again, thank you to all our speakers, Professor Raja, Professor Dirks, Professor Anis, and Dr. Rahul.
Thank you, all of you.
Right, and do have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.